Well, welcome. We called the seminar, What Are We Fighting For? Because that way we can literally talk about anything we want, and it'll somewhat qualify this seminar. So that'll be fine, right? No, Zach, I want to introduce to you first, if you don't know Zach. So Zach Saylor, Zach and his wife Janelle have been coming to our church for a while now. Janelle's right here in the front, so if he says anything off kilter, you could just take it up with her later. But Zach has this fascinating context that he brings to the table for conversations like this. And I'm going to introduce you a little bit because I can brag on you a little bit. So Zach actually developed a software platform called Jupyter. It's a shared open source software that's used in the scientific community worldwide to analyze, aggregate, and then present data. And really some scientific conclusions are presented using their software platform. And so as a result of the development of this software, Zach was hired by Apple to work in their programming area so that he could manage that software for the purposes that Apple uses the software. So the reason I say that is because it gives Zach this really unique convergence of two worlds: the scientific community, which is data-driven, and then the software and programming community, which is all theory-driven. Right? So you have very different approaches kind of coming together. And on top of that, he loves Jesus and studies the Word of God and has a lot of strong biblical basis for the way that he thinks about the world. And so I really wanted you to hear from Zach, but here's what we want to talk about. In arguments, in conversations, in these sort of heated debates, I've often realized, as I've entertained a lot of these conversations, you can imagine, I do. Someone asked me last night, like, what kind of approach I take in talking about these issues, and I say I mostly just listen. So I just do a lot of nodding and smiling in my office because everyone has a strong opinion, right? But what I've often heard is people are arguing from an unstable foundation. In other words, their facts are squishy at best, and I can't always point to sources for information when you're having these kind of arguments. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that with Zach, and what we're going to do is we're going to present kind of three ideas, three concepts, and with each of those three ideas, we're going to present a warning. So my hope is that when you walk away from our time together, that you'll have a kind of a clear warning for how to approach, and maybe even at some level you might avoid approaching some arguments that you might right now feel really strong about, but realizing I don't have a lot of foundation or room to ground to stand on in making that argument. And I want to just help you understand where the sources are. And so first, let me just get started. Anything you want to add, Zach, to that amazing introduction? Has anybody introduced you that well before?
Wow. No, other than I think I told Jeff when we first started talking about this that there's a ton of imposter syndrome that I feel being up here. But I do want to say that so I've been in the science community since I was 19 years old. I started in a condensed matter physics lab, and I was in the scientific research world for the first 7 years of my career. So I have a PhD in evolutionary biophysics, which, being somebody who's both in the church and in the evolutionary biology community, I have a unique perspective possibly there. And I've been in the physics community for a long time. And then alongside of that, I started developing, to do my research better, this piece of software, co-developing with a few folks from around the world, this piece of software that then blew up, and it kind of became the de facto standard for analyzing data. I say all that to just back up that, like, data and the process of analyzing data and then communicating it to the public is literally my life. I've been doing it since I was 20, maybe 19 years old. I'm 33 now. So I recognize being up here that I don't have a lot of life experience, so I'm not speaking from that angle, but I'm speaking from somebody who understands how the raw data comes off the measuring device and then lands on your ears, the general public, when it comes to topics. We were originally going to talk about climate change.
We still might.
Okay, all right. But the reason I say all that is there's a couple of things we're going to talk about, I think, throughout this hour where I've just seen the lost in translation there. and I maybe have a unique way to present that or describe that to you. And so I think we're going to dive into that a lot.
And that's a perfect segue, because that's the first question I had for you, Zach, is for you to explain to us the relationship between data and then interpretation of data. Because that's, let's just take climate change, for example. There's a lot of data out there, and yet there are presentations of data that we all get in a variety of ways all the time. And at times it feels very confusing because there seems to be a lot of diversity in the way we're presented the data. But let's even just take that as an example. Talk to me about the difference between data and the interpretation of data.
Yeah, so data, in the scientific community, when you write a paper and you publish something that you're going to try to argue for, which is the goal of science, it's not just to make measurements, it's then to form theories around those measurements. The raw data that comes off the measuring device is rarely what you're presented, even in a scientific paper. There's sitting between you and the raw data. In the scientific community, we would call it a model. It's the thing that says, based on this observation, this is what I think the conclusion is. Every single model is wrong. Some are better than others. That's like a quote we say in the scientific community all the time. So for every piece of data that comes off a machine, there can be thousands of interpretations, or another word for that is models. And so you're always reading through that lens of someone's interpretation of the data. So the place we need to agree on, that needs to be, I said this to Jeff, like, we tend to say that in this kind of modern world, there's no capital T truth to people outside of the church. That's not necessarily true. The capital T truth to a scientist is the raw measurement they get. They actually believe that is a true observation, and that holds the highest place in their perspective of the world. And then they're trying to translate what that observation means for what they should do next. Okay, so everybody is trying to apply an interpretation to what they see, and everyone is forming different interpretations. In the scientific community, you acknowledge up front. When you write a publication, you acknowledge up front that it is your interpretation. And so it's well understood that this is one angle on that data. And then, like I said, for every piece of data that comes off a measuring device, there might be 100 papers published about that one data point, or realistically a data set, sharing 100 different opinions, 100 different models, and 100 different interpretations. So you have to understand the difference between data and interpretation.
When you say every model is wrong or every interpretation is wrong, what do you mean by that? There's a percentage of error, or what's the?
No, it's you have you can't measure everything all the time forever. You always have it's your measuring device might not be complete. It might not be able to measure everything you need to form a complete picture. You're not measuring from the start of creation to the end of all time. So there's always a limitation on what you get to peek into. The data is your view into how the world is working or the universe is working. Your model is working with the limited information it has. And then you're also applying some intuition to start with. So your model isn't, it's always informed by some sort of intuition you have. And so you acknowledge that intuition up front and say, I'm going to apply what I think this data is saying, and then I'm going to judge how well it does on predicting the next events that come. And that's how you're measuring how good your model is. And some will predict the future much better than others. And so, you're applying your intuition up front, and and then from there, your job is to figure out and measure how well is it doing at predicting future events.
Okay, so not all models are created equally. There's some models that are better than others.
That's right.
And seem to be maybe more accurate than others is another way to say that.
That's right.
But there's sometimes seems like to me there's only one model presented.
Yeah.
How does that get determined?
Yeah, okay.
What model are we getting? Take any kind of scientific argument, and we only seem to hear one model.
That's right. So the other thing is that I said to Jeff is, so you need to know the difference between data and interpretation. The other thing you need to know is that in the scientific community, you don't get to publish a paper without upfront saying your uncertainty in that model and measuring some level of error or uncertainty that you have. And we don't use the word certainty, we use the word uncertainty, because you don't have the ability to measure how certain you are this is the exact way the universe works. But you can somewhat quantify how bad your model is. The problem is that there's every model you can say, given my model, there is a most likely outcome that we predict from this thing. And then there's an uncertainty associated with that. Scientists are way more interested in talking about the uncertainty you have in that than the actual most likely scenario. And the reason why is, let's say climate change. You look at all the climate data, you build a model, and you say in 50 years, what's going to happen to our planet? Let's say you have 100 outcomes possible that your model predicts, okay? It's possible that the most likely outcome of that model is that the planet will end, but it has a 2% chance of happening because the other 99 options have less than 2%, right? Because you've got to sum up to 100. They might have a 1% or a 1.5%, but the conclusion of your model is the most likely scenario is that the world's going to end, but it has such a unlikely scenario. It's very, very uncertain. And the problem is that by publishing in that paper, the most likely scenario of the world happening with the data that we're seeing on climate change is that the planet's going to end. That's the thing that the people who are going to write to the general public about are going to pick up on.
Because it sells.
It sells. So what they're looking for is, you reported that the most likely outcome is the world's going to end, even though the person who said that is like, yeah, we had to say that because that's true of our model, but it's up against the other 98% outcome, which is the sum of all the other possible outcomes happening.
There's a 98% chance the world is definitely not going to end.
Exactly.
But 2% says...
But technically...
That's a good news article, though. Right. The world's going to end. We just sold newspapers.
That's right.
And
so
clicks.
So the most likely outcome and then the uncertainty of that most likely outcome is where things get lost in translation. And so
that's the difference between what you would call what two science communities.
Yeah. So there's what's happening in the kind of core science community, which is the place where I spend a lot of my time and live in. And then there's what we would call, which is a little bit of a derogatory term, but it's the popular science community. So these are the people that are they're going into the scientific community looking for something interesting to tell people, and then they're writing stories about it. And they're going to look for the things that are going to sell, right? It's clickbait. And so the things that you're going to hit on those flashy sites that then are going to be picked up by your CNNs or your Fox News or whatever. The things that say if you eat chocolate every day, you're going to live an extra 7 years, right? Those kinds of things is because they're looking for the sentence in a paper that they can honestly say this paper said the most likely outcome is that climate change is going to lead to the end of the world. But if you were to actually dive into that paper, and by the way, they're going to pick one paper instead of scientific community will always, if you look at a scientific paper, they have to publish references of hundreds behind their paper to even justify getting their thing out there. And if you read a single scientific paper, you'll find it's not that interesting. It's like small little increments of contributions to the conversation. But then you have this paper that will be written about it that will say, this is the most transformative result because of one thing they pulled out of the paper that they said is, the likely scenario from our model says the world's going to end. And so it's that popular science layer, which is just doing bad journalism. But they're doing it because they're incentivized to sell.
But I love the chocolate model. Like,
yeah, it backs our
that's
theories.
Gotta be true.
It backs our theories.
Like, there's a coffee model for that too. That says if you drink more.
That's true.
Coffee. That's true. So we have a distinction between the scientific community and popular science, which is promoting clickbait for us, and we grab onto these things. So what's the warning here for us? What's the point? I think what you and I were talking about is it just specifically relates to. Let's just go back to our example of climate change. Well, I'm arguing for something that I read one article from a popular science journalist who was standing outside the door of a lab and overheard someone discussing a model. Is it fair to summarize it that way? I mean, maybe that's overgeneralization.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not that. There are some that are better than others. And what can you do in this scenario? Well, there's in certain problems like climate change, the raw data is published. Same with, I I hate to say the word COVID right now. It's maybe too soon. But COVID was a really interesting one, and maybe we can talk about that as, in this too. But I sat kind of in a position of seeing, I left a evolutionary biophysics, biochemistry lab who had to pivot in the height of the pandemic to go do vaccine research. Like, how are we going to, so I watched, people, I think when they think of COVID, they think of these big pharmaceutical companies looking for a cash grab to make a lot of money selling you this thing that's bad for your body. And what you don't realize is that what we missed in the political conversation that happened above that was that the people who studied that virus, identified a vulnerability in it, and then started to create the research that led to a vaccine were 25 to 30-year-old, your kids working endlessly in a lab when they, at the time of the first month of the pandemic, the models, right, on the limited data that we had that was saying the infection rates and then deaths that followed up from that infection rate were giving us models that said the most likely outcome was that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the world was going to die with a ton of uncertainty, right? They didn't know, but they were just saying our early models on the 2 weeks of data we've gotten of how this thing is moving is saying that one of the higher outcomes is that we lose a lot of people. What should we do? And the scientists were like, if you're going to ask us, probably the smartest thing to do is stay in your houses. Don't go out and spread it. And then you had your graduate students in labs literally working 16-hour days straight for a year. And we're missing the amazing effort that went into that from our kids because of this lost in translation that happened. And a lot of that was just people kind of projecting and then, articles being written off of what was happening as a follow-up to that, that I got to see firsthand, right? I had my friends from my graduate labs who were spending their 2 years committing their life to what they felt was a save-the-world effort. And then I had people that I would engage with outside, and I didn't have a strong opinion. I certainly don't think that the government's job is to mandate vaccines. I think that that's an overreach. But what we missed was the amazing thing that our youth had produced. And so I saw both perspectives, and I was trying to share that with folks if they wanted to hear it. But it really, really exposed this lost in translation. And so what I don't know, so the question is, what do we do? Like, how do you, if popular science is my only access to this information, one, it's not. All of the data for the vaccine, by the way, that's what people don't know, is the recipe for the vaccine is published openly. It wasn't created by pharmaceutical companies, it was manufactured by them, but the original creation happened in open research labs that were doing their best to make sure all this information was coming out openly and publicly. The problem is that I'm a PhD in biochemistry, and reading those papers, it was dense.
We're not going to probably be able to make a lot of sense of the papers. Yeah.
And so I think you have two options. One, you have to read, if you're going to become an expert or you're going to become informed on a topic, you have to read 100 to 200 of these things on one particular topic, sharing all different points of views. From both sides of, if you think they're leaning a different political direction, you have to read 200. You don't get to read one. Realistically, we don't have that time in our lives to do that on every topic we want to be informed on. So I think the best thing you can do is change your posture and recognize that, I'm reading this through a model or an interpretation, and all models are wrong. Some are better than others.
That's such a good point. So I'm not going to take the time to read 100 or 200 papers on most things. Some things I've read a lot of papers on. So it does have to impact then my approach to the guy that I disagree with, because I'm standing on shaky ground when I'm making an argument.
Yeah, you both are.
We both are,
both
right?
Sides
and
are.
So the warning for me is be careful what you're fighting for. What are you going to stand? Are you really willing to go out on a limb on this particular topic? Do you really know all the data? And if I haven't studied, the hundreds and hundreds of pages of data, raw data. I've just read one popular science article, or maybe two, because I wanted to see what the other side had to say, right? Now I think I'm an expert. I read Fox and CNN, so I'm good.
You want to take it a level deeper?
Yeah.
You want to go? Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
So now first half of my career is sitting in science, second half of career is sitting inside of one of the largest tech companies in the world. What's even worse there is because clickbait is the way to get money, right, is to optimize. And I'll tell you that I have a window inside of watching these organizations navigate the ethics behind what they're doing. And we have and maybe rightfully so, we'll paint them as like this sinister, the big tech is and social media is the problem. And I think you picture like there's like people behind the scenes turning knobs, controlling you.
And they're laughing.
And they're laughing like, I'm getting, but all they're doing is writing software that's optimizing for money, and it turns out that optimizing for money exposes humans' vulnerabilities, which is falling into echo chambers and clickbait. And what you find is that before the social media age, news came to you through TV. The problem is that it was really hard to gauge what people were thinking through TV, other than just the raw viewership numbers. How many people were watching Fox versus CNN versus MSNBC, et cetera. With social media, we have the ability to put things in front of you, give you a feed, and watch how you respond on each individual nugget, and then start to transform that in real time to show you different things. And so the news that you're getting is not only filtered through someone's interpretation, but also their analysis of you as an individual on each individual topic, and then tuning those things to put more in front of you that will keep you there longer. And usually that's through reinforcing what you already believe.
It's terrifying.
Right. And it's not because there's a person behind the scenes doing it. It's because we're deploying stuff to optimize for this one metric.
Algorithm technology.
It's the algorithm. Yeah. It's unfortunate because so if your main source of news is coming through something that the feed is controlled by an algorithm, you are going to be prone to seeing something even worse than 50 years ago when it was just television, because they didn't have the same insight into what you respond to. Yeah. All they had was, we're going to put this out there and see if people watch us. But now we're going to put this out there and see if you like it or how long you spend on the page. And we can do that on individual news articles, not a stream, not a single program of TV for a day.
Yeah.
Wow. And so it's even more tuned and customized. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're really getting a very narrow slice of the world.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing to realize as a caution, is just be careful what you believe so strongly is the thing, right? And just maybe a point of clarification, we're not talking about biblical truth right now. Like, we all know where the capital T truth lies in Scripture. We're talking about social issues that we're all reading about, studying about, forming opinions on, and then communicating about. And so as it relates to the social issues, this is a cautionary tale of where the information comes from, how it's curated for you, and then it should inform the posture of our argument as a result of that. Let me shift gears a little bit, because I think it could feel relatively disheartening just to say, like, you don't know all the things, stop arguing all the things. There are some things that we do know, and there are some things that we have spent time reading about, researching, understanding. I think what I would love to explore with you, Zach, a little bit is so what do I do about the things that I feel informed about and convicted by? And maybe I've even spent time in prayer about feeling this is a social issue that I really do feel like is a worthy cause. I need to do something for this cause. How do we approach that? Maybe knowing that, I'm recognizing there could be some holes in some gaps in my research, but what do I do? I mean, we've kind of taken the top down, like, let's vote for the right person to get the right person in office and get the right policies in place, and even institutionally as it relates to, let's say, Apple. Yeah. I mean, let's get the right leadership, right? And then we're going to be able to solve the problems, the social problems.
Yeah, that's right.
How does that work in your environment?
Yeah. So I think, one, it's helpful to just set up your posture, in similar to how the conversation happens in a scientific community, which is acknowledge your uncertainty up front. So you can enter the conversation I think we've practiced that a lot through this conference of say what you're feeling, and that's okay, but also acknowledge that you're looking through a lens that's broken. just as they are. Everybody's looking through a scratch lens with a little blur. So that's one thing. And then two, I said this to Jeff too, one of the things that I've wrestled with most in my job at Apple has been that I don't share a lot of the values of the organization I work for. And that's presented with me a problem of, what do I do? Is it unethical or unbiblical for me to be sitting inside this company? Should I go work for somewhere else? And there's this analogy that I've been using in these conversations with people that have helped me post-process this, and it was, imagine you're on a ship heading for an iceberg, big ship. How do you change the direction of that ship? Well, I think really have two ways of doing it. You either are the captain of that ship, and you tell everybody to start turning left or right to miss that iceberg. Or you get a bunch, maybe the captain's not listening, he's like, we're going to keep going forward, shut up. I'm going to do what I want to do. Or you get to be one of the crewsmen, and you work with a bunch of other crewmen. You start to work up enough of a body mass, and you start turning the ship. Like, you can't do it by yourself, but you can start to create some change around the people, or with the people around you. You get enough of those, you can start to turn the ship. I don't think the answer is that you jump ship and you run. And so I think what I've in the Apple context for me, I don't think the answer is that all Christians should not work at Apple or leave Apple. I think Apple is too big of a force in modern day. There's 1 billion iPhones in the world. I don't think the answer is Christians leave Apple. I think the answer is we got to get more Christians into Apple and start changing it from the bottom up. There's probably a low chance that I'm going to replace Tim Cook at the CEO position.
But there's a chance.
I mean,
there's a model for that.
Yeah.
Right.
It's right. There is. There's an outcome. I don't even think it's most likely outcome. A lot of uncertainty. But that's true in science too. So when we moved to Atascadero 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago now, Zach Talbert, who was a youth pastor at this time, we really hit it off and he got me involved in youth group, and I've been involved in youth group ever since. Because he said, I think we need, I care about the youth and investing in the youth, and there's a lot of different dimensions through which I want to empower them for the future, and one of them is science. And so we shared this mutual thing of, there's a lot of kids who may be coming through the system that have science as something that piques their interest, but they get a little bit presented with this world that feels like science and faith can't be on the same, they don't overlap, right? And it's not always because the church is saying don't believe in science or science is saying don't believe in faith. It's usually because they're rarely talked about in the same building, right? Science is talked about at school where we're writing legislation that keeps faith out of the school. And then how many science talks does Jeff give from the pulpit?
Thankfully, not very many. You would not.
And that's not
back.
their fault. But in some sense, what it does is it accidentally creates a worldview to our youth that those don't exist in the same place, that they're kind of opposite one another. And so my interest in being in youth group has always been giving them a little bit of overlap of those two. Because what I want is we need more more Christians in the scientific community. And it's much easier to work on the next generation than try to fix the one that's in there now. And so that's my my bottom-up approach, right? Is let's work with the youth. If there's some that are interested in science, don't scare them away from it. Get them involved in it.
Yeah, and it's do your part, right?
Exactly.
Like there are things we can all do. And maybe just come back to the climate change conversation for a second. I've had conversations with people that are so concerned about the state of the environment that they're signing petitions and they're lobbying for specific policies, and that's kind of a top-down approach. It's not wrong. I don't discredit that effort. But at the same time, you notice people that are getting petitions signed, and then they're throwing trash, in the gutter. It's like, well, I mean, if you care about the earth, like maybe don't put your trash in the gutter, right? Like that's a step. You could at least do that, right? Like let's take one very, very small step. The example I always like to use, this thing boggles my mind. There's a policy right now that's being pushed through legislation in California to give a grant so every family I think every adult in California could get a free e-bike, right? Like, so I love that. I mean, I'm a bike guy, so I'm like, yeah, everybody needs a free e-bike. And so these people are like, they're signing legislation, they're doing, and I read a news article of a politician that was for this campaign that she actually drove her SUV to work with the bike on the back of the car, and then took the bike off the back of the car and then walked it into the office as if she had ridden her bike to work, right? Like, it's that kind of insanity in our world. And so to me, I have a large degree of uncertainty on all of the data. I haven't read what you've read. And so for me, if I could just distill it way down, as it relates to engaging with social policy, I think the simplest thing I can do, and what I'm hearing from you, is I should just do my part, like do my small things, right? Like if I care about the environment, well, why don't you just recycle those bottles instead of throw them in the trash? You know, simple things like that. Or if I care so much about some of the social, like for instance, Rick's brought up a couple times, the immigration issue. We care about immigrants and we want to help love the marginalized, but we won't accept them into our church or our home. You know, like some of those things that we care about the policy. We want the policy to change. So it's a caution, I think, for us to be willing to do our part. Again, just one more time, shifting gears, because we're going to run out of time here. I think one of the clearest messages I heard last night was to what you're saying, the point of posture. You know, that approaching friends and neighbors and relatives and people that you're having conversations with as a listener and a learner. And here's one thing that I've learned from you is that when I'm having a conversation, I can quickly realize if this person is deeply convicted based on data and research, or if they're deeply convicted based on feelings. Can we talk about the difference of that for a minute? And, you know, when you're having those kind of conversations, like you can kind of, it's almost like you could kind of sniff it out, right? Yeah. How do you approach that person differently? What do we do in those conversations where we go, I think this guy has no clue what he's talking about, but he really cares about it, right? Have you had some of those conversations?
Yeah. Those ones, speaking of the pricking and leaking, those ones are tough for me. That's one for me of, I don't know a lot of things, but I know a lot about a little things. So the ones that'll get me is if they'll prick me on the ones where I'm like, I spent, like a lot of hours looking at raw data on this particular topic. And, I don't get to control their side or their opinion or their view. I think it is a little bit of asking more about what their experience, why they, it's unpeeling back the layers of their particular perspective. That's more important than winning the argument. That's the theme that I got from yesterday's was let's be more interested in their story than winning the argument. Because it's not productive. And so I think back to the top-down, bottom-up thing as part of this is where do you get to make the most change, positive impact that follows along your lines? It's generally one by picking up a shovel and doing the thing that you think is important for the topic at hand, and maybe sharing with other people why you're doing that. But do it through action. Like if you're going to talk about it, better have an action that you get to point to that you've been doing to pick that up. And also know that generally we all have, I think one of the things that they said yesterday too was this, there's 6 values or 10 values in the world that everyone shares. And if you recognize that, that's kind of at the root of all of this. And we're all just coming up with different ways to try to follow through on that value. And so if you recognize, like, maybe we're actually trying to solve the same problem, we're just going at it at different angles, is healthy. Like, try to get to that. Figure out what underlies it. and the motivation for what they're doing. And then, just get involved yourself on the things that you care about. Don't disengage from the top. You still need to vote, but honestly, you're probably most likely your major impact will be the vote, the one vote you get in whatever 70 million there are. So it's a very small piece. So don't disengage from that, but recognize relative to what you can do right here in your local community, that vote is very small. So trying to hit at the top, don't throw all your punches at the top. It just takes too long. Worrying about who's in the president's seat, or who's the leader of an organization or whatever like that, you can commit your whole life to fighting that battle and make no headway. And I just think that the place where we can make the most impact and the pound per punch that we can make is down at the bottom.
So engaging with somebody, back to that, it was a really helpful, I think, like you said, that understanding that those things are really going to prick me. If I've done some homework and research and I realize they really haven't, how does that change your approach? Do you write them off, or do you just simply realize I'm certainly not going to convince them of anything? So the best thing I can do is
you could tell I'm dodging the question because I
know you are.
I haven't handled this well. I honestly think it's I generally withdraw in that conversation. I think it's not my tendency is to puff up and then come to them with 100 things that I've read and be like, you need to read these. And they're not going to. And honestly, they're going to come back with the 3 articles they read, and I'm not going to read those. Right? So it's a lose-lose. And so generally, what I want, maybe a helpful thing, and maybe this is where I was trying to get, is to really, really ask, like, how do I get involved? Like, your point of view, how do I get involved in it? In terms of what are the things you're doing to do it? And I'm not asking that to say, are you doing anything? I'm not trying to be aggressive. I'm mostly like, what I really care about is climate change, so I'm going to go and get an EV, which, okay, that was a bad example. But, maybe I have, these are the things that I think are going to change it. And then ask, like, do you think that, present it to them, like, I think this is actually making, moving the needle a little bit. Do you think it is? And have some inquisitive conversations about that. And invite them into what you're doing to comment on it. And then be ready to hear what they have to say. And that's maybe the healthiest thing you can do.
That's good. I love that. So taking a posture as a learner just to say, tell me how you're engaged in this thing that you care so deeply about. Not what they think about it. We now know what they think about it. Tell me how you're engaged in this thing that you care so deeply about. Maybe I have something to learn from what you're doing in proactivity towards the end that you care. And that might actually inform what's driving their value system too, right? That you learn they actually care more about community than they do policy. So the reason they're so engaged is because they just want community around them. They want friendships. They just need an organization to rally around. That's really helpful. And then I think on the back end of that, understanding that you're not, it's kind of, I hate to say this, it's kind of the know when to hold them, know when to fold them, right? Like, just to be able to say, there is no chance I'm going to provide any information to this person that they're going to hear because they are so staunch in their understanding of very, very naive information with backing it up, right? So like, I'm gonna resolve in my mind, I'm not gonna try to change this person's mind. There's not a chance I could do that. So now I take a different posture, a different approach, and I'm just gonna try to learn why they care so much about it, right? That's so helpful. And that brings me, and we'll wrap here, unless you have some final thoughts, but I think Paul speaks so clearly to that end in Philippians 1 when he's kind of setting the table. Here's what he says at the very kind of beginning of the book of Philippians. It's verse 8. He says, "For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with affection of Christ Jesus, and it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more. So here's where, we kind of start with the love, and, that's a popular sentiment when we're having these kind of conversations. And a lot of times we just hear, oh, love, 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 love. But that's not where Paul goes. He starts with love, but then he goes very quickly and says that your love may abound more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent. What I hear Paul saying is, let's get enough knowledge to have an eye at the topic and an eye towards their argument, but then be able to discern what is excellent and be able to say, I'm not going there. I'm not going to try to change this person's mind, because I've got spiritual discernment that says nothing I do and say is going to help win this person over. And so best I can do is love them and hear from them. Let me hear their story. And maybe hearing their story will inform me to some extent on how to love them better. It probably won't change your mind on any given value topic, but at least I'm not going to have much success with trying to win this person over, so I'm taking a different approach to the conversation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's good. Really good.
So let's take Paul's cues. Zach, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
so
you.
helpful
Thank you,
just to
Jeff.
hear that content. Yeah. Any final words for us?
No. Let's end it there.
Yeah. So I'm going to go on a limb here for a second.
Okay.
Janelle might actually not favor this, but Zach and Janelle, they're an active part of our church. They lead small groups and student ministries, and Zach cares deeply about science and how we view and see science. So if anything he said has piqued your interest and wow, I want to hear more, buy him some coffee, and I don't know how much time you have to do that. Janelle's like, maybe one or two. But we can get you in contact and grab lunch or grab coffee and continue this conversation. That's the beauty of all of our seminars today, are all leaders within our church. And so we have the opportunity to continue this dialogue. So let me close this in prayer. Father, thank you so much for introducing to us maybe a new way to think about how we're arguing the things and where we're getting the research and the data. Thank you for Zach, for the mind that you have blessed him with, Lord, and equipped him with. You've gifted him to be a resource and a tool, not only in the workplace environment as a voice of truth and someone who cares deeply about the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ working its way into the lives of every single human being, but also someone who cares deeply about the church and wants to see our church equipped and our church informed on how these things work and how the world is working. And so, Lord, would you continue to bless he and Janelle and their little ones as they continue to strive after you. And thanks for the time we've had together today. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, thank you, guys. It is 10:15, and I believe that the next seminar starts at 10:30. Let me just verify that before I see. Yeah, 10:30. So once again, over in downtown is Ben Tomasini's seminar on video, and Jeff Zippy's in the back in E102.